Welcome to Calm Before Dreams, a quiet place where gentle stories and soft atmospheres guide you toward peaceful rest. Tonight, our journey brings us to a quiet railway platform in a small seaside town, where time seems to slow, where soft lamps glow through the evening mist, and where the rhythm of arriving and departing trains carries something more than distance. Something tender, something quietly lasting. I'm Atlas, and I'll be your narrator for this evening's story, The Railway Platform Where Time Slowed and Love Stayed. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you are listening from tonight. Share it in the comments below. It's always comforting to see how far our calm little community reaches across the world. Now settle in, take a slow breath, and let the gentle hush of the platform, the distant hum of the rails, and the quiet unfolding of this story carry you softly into the night. I remember the railway platform before I understood that anything in my life was about to change. In those evenings, it was only a place at the edge of a quiet seaside town, where the lamps came on one by one through a veil of mist, and the sea, though hidden in the dark, could still be heard breathing somewhere beyond the tracks. Everything there seemed to move gently. The wind carried salt, coal, and rain. The rails held the last of the fading light. Even time itself felt less strict in that hour, as though it loosened its collar and settled beside me to wait. I went there at first for no grand reason. I liked the sameness of it, the comfort of returning to the same boards, the same bench, the same sound of distant wheels and soft announcements. But that was before I understood how quietly a life could turn. Before I learned that love does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it steps onto a platform in the evening and simply stays. The evening air always met me the same way, cool enough to rest against my skin, never sharp, never demanding. It carried that quiet dampness that belonged to places where stone, iron, and sea shared the same breath. When I stepped onto the platform, I could feel the day loosening behind me, as if the town itself had gently set down its weight for the night. The wooden boards beneath my shoes were worn smooth by years of footsteps, and I often found myself wondering how many lives had paused there without leaving any visible trace. I did not hurry when I arrived. There was no reason to. The station seemed to exist outside of urgency, especially in that last hour of evening when the lamps glowed softly and the mist moved in slow, wandering threads above the rails. Sometimes I would rest my hand along the back of a bench, feeling the last warmth of the day fading from the wood. Sometimes I simply stood near the edge, not too close, watching the track stretch into a distance that always felt longer at dusk than it did in daylight. There were small sounds, always the same, always different. A door closing somewhere beyond the road. The faint rattle of something unsettled by the breeze. The low murmur of voices that never stayed long. Even silence had texture there. It was not empty. It was full of quiet things continuing without needing to be noticed. I began to understand that this was why I returned. Not for the trains, not really, but for the stillness that gathered just before they came. It was a stillness that asked nothing of me. I did not have to be useful or proper, or observed in the way the town so gently required during the day. I could simply be present, and that was enough. And in that presence, something in me began to settle, though I could not yet name what it was. The town where I lived was called Brightmar, though few beyond the coast ever spoke its name. It rested along the southern edge of England, where the land gave itself quietly to the sea, and where the rhythm of life was shaped as much by tides as by clocks. In those later Victorian years, when gas lamps still held their place against the dark, the railway had already threaded itself into our days, binding us to places we would never see and to people we would never meet. My walk to the station took me past the last row of brick houses, their windows dimming one by one as evening settled. Beyond them, the road opened slightly, and the scent of the sea grew clearer, carried in soft breaths that touched everything without urgency. Even when the water could not be seen, it was always present, resting in the air, in the wood, in the iron, in the quiet taste left on the lips. The station itself stood with a kind of patient endurance. Its brickwork had darkened over years of weather and smoke, and its painted signs had begun to soften at the edges, though they were still carefully kept. Inside, the waiting room held its tiled floor and long benches, polished by use rather than care. By the time I arrived each evening, the ticket window would already be closed, yet the lamps remained lit, and someone always lingered nearby, as though the place refused to be entirely abandoned. What I remember most is the light. The way it changed slowly, almost thoughtfully. The sky would pass from pale gold into a quiet rose, and then into that deepening blue-gray that softened every outline. The lamps did not banish the dark. They welcomed it, each one offering a small circle of warmth that seemed to hold its own time within it. Everything in Brightmar moved by habit. The bells, the shops, the footsteps, the closing doors. It was a life that asked for little and explained even less. And yet, in the space between those habits, in the hour when the station grew still, something else began to exist. Something not bound by the same steady rules. I did not think of it as important then. I only knew that I was drawn there, evening after evening, as though the platform held a quiet answer to a question I had never fully asked. My days, before the evenings took on their quiet importance, were shaped by the steady work of the draper's shop on Chapel Row. I lived above it with my aunt, in narrow rooms that held the scent of pressed linen and dried rosemary from the small garden behind the house. Each morning began the same way, shutters opened, counters cleared, fabric brought forward into the light. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing what would be required before the first customer even stepped through the door. I spent my hours folding cloth, measuring ribbon, wrapping parcels in brown paper, and tying each one with careful knots of string. My hands learned the textures of things more quickly than my thoughts did. Smooth cotton, fine muslin, sturdy wool, the faint whisper of silk drawn across wood. Customers came with quiet purpose. A length of black ribbon for morning. New gloves for Sunday. A child's dress to be let out at the seams. Their voices rarely rose above what was necessary, and I answered in the same tone, as though the whole shop agreed to keep the world outside at a gentle distance. At midday, the bell above the door seemed to ring more often. By afternoon, the light shifted, angling through the window and catching dust in the air like something briefly suspended between movement and stillness. My aunt kept the accounts with steady attention, her pen moving in small, precise strokes that rarely needed correction. We spoke little during those hours, not from coldness but from habit. Words were saved for what truly required them. By the time evening approached, the town itself began to soften. Deliveries slowed. Footsteps grew fewer. The final customers lingered only briefly before returning home. I would close the shutters, count what needed counting, and remove my apron, feeling the quiet transition from usefulness to something less defined. No one questioned where I went after that. A walk in the evening air was considered sensible, even proper. And so I stepped out each night, following the same path, carrying nothing with me except the calm that came from knowing exactly where I was going, and the unspoken sense that the day had not yet quite finished with me. By the time I had made the station part of my evenings, I had also come to know, in a quiet and unspoken way, the people who belonged to it. Not through introductions, not through any formal acquaintance, but through repetition, the gentle familiarity that forms when lives cross at the same hour often enough to settle into recognition. Mr. Fenwick, the station master, carried himself with a careful precision that never quite relaxed, even in the softest light of evening. His collar was always set too tightly, his mustache kept in a line so exact it seemed to resist the wind itself. I would often see him checking his pocket watch, then glancing toward the large clock beneath the awning, as if confirming that time had not, somehow, slipped out of alignment without his notice. There was something almost comforting in his insistence on order, as though he stood as a quiet guard against uncertainty. Then there was Jonah Reed, the porter, whose presence felt as steady as the platform boards beneath our feet. He moved with a calm strength, lifting trunks and cases as though their weight belonged more to the journey than to him. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always with a softness that made people listen without needing to be asked. Once, I saw him return a dropped glove to an elderly woman before she had even realized it was missing. He did not wait for thanks. He simply nodded and continued on, as though kindness were a task no more remarkable than any other. Others came and went, travelers, visitors, faces that passed through without settling, but these two remained part of the station's quiet rhythm. And then one evening I noticed someone new. At first he did not seem remarkable. A traveler, like many others, stepping down from the evening train with a single case in hand. His coat held the faint memory of other places, dust at the hem, a trace of rain that did not belong to our town. But what caught my attention was not his appearance. It was the way he paused after stepping onto the platform, just for a moment, as though listening for something that had not yet made a sound. I remember thinking, without knowing why, that he was not entirely passing through. In a town like Brightmar, one did not need to be told how life should unfold. It was understood in glances, in pauses, in the quiet agreement of daily routine. There were expectations that settled gently but firmly, like dust that no one thought to disturb. A young woman was expected to be steady, useful, and not given to unnecessary wandering. A traveler was expected to arrive, conduct his purpose, and depart again without leaving anything behind. A railway platform was not a place where anything lasting should take root. I knew all of this without ever having heard it spoken aloud. My own life had already begun to take its shape, though no one had asked whether it was the shape I would have chosen. There was the shop, my aunt, the steady passage of days marked by small, practical tasks. There was comfort in it, yes, and a kind of quiet dignity. But there was also a narrowness that I rarely examined too closely, as though looking directly at it might make it more difficult to accept. And yet each evening I stepped outside of that pattern, if only for an hour. As for him, though I did not yet know his name then, there was a similar sense of something contained within him. His clothes were well kept but not new. His manner was calm, yet not entirely at ease. When he spoke, it was with clarity, but also with a restraint that suggested he had learned at some point to keep certain things unspoken. When we first exchanged words, they were small enough to vanish into the air almost as soon as they were spoken. A remark about the wind shifting earlier than expected. A brief observation about the chill settling sooner with the season. Nothing that would invite memory. And yet, the next evening when I saw him again, there was the faintest sense that something had continued. It was not excitement. Not even curiosity in any urgent form. Only a quiet awareness, like noticing that a familiar room held one object more than it had the day before. I did not question it. In Brightmar, one learned not to question the small things too closely. And still, something had changed, however slightly, and I could feel it in the way the evening seemed to gather itself more carefully around that hour. The evenings did not change all at once. They shifted so gradually that I could not have named the moment when they became something more than habit. At first, I continued as I always had, finishing my work, closing the shop, stepping into the cooling air with no expectation beyond the quiet comfort of the station. And yet, without my noticing when it began, I started to look for him. He was not always there at the same instant, but he came often enough that his presence settled into the rhythm of the place. Sometimes he arrived on the train, stepping down with that same brief pause as though listening. Other times he was already on the platform when I reached it, standing near the far end where the lamps were spaced a little farther apart. On those evenings, I would feel a small, steady recognition, not unlike the feeling of seeing a familiar window lit in an otherwise dark street. Our conversations grew in the smallest of measures. A greeting became a few exchanged thoughts. A few thoughts became a walk along the length of the platform and back again. There was no sense of effort in it, no moment where we seemed to decide to know one another better. It simply happened as naturally as the mist moving across the rails or the lamps brightening as the sky dimmed. We spoke of ordinary things. The way the sea sounded different in colder weather. The peculiar stillness that sometimes settled over the town before rain. Books that had once held our attention and then drifted from memory. He mentioned places he had passed through, York, Bath, London, but never lingered on them long enough to explain why he had left. I told him about the shop, about the way certain fabrics seemed to change character under lamplight, about how the day could be measured in textures as much as in hours. Silences, too, began to take their place between us, and they were not uncomfortable. We could stand side by side without speaking, watching the line stretch into the distance, listening for the train that would eventually come. In those moments, time seemed to loosen, as though it no longer required strict accounting. There were small peculiarities, though I hardly allowed myself to dwell on them. Once, the station clock seemed to lag behind by several minutes, only to correct itself when I looked again. Another evening, the distant whistle sounded far earlier than expected, yet the train did not arrive until long after. These things did not trouble me. If anything, they seemed to belong to the same gentle shifting that had begun to shape those hours. And within that softened sense of time, our meetings continued, each one carrying forward something unspoken from the last. What grew between us did not arrive with any clear beginning, nor did it ask to be named. It settled instead into the smallest gestures, the kind that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not standing within them. I found that I began to recognize his step before I saw him, a particular steadiness against the boards that distinguished itself from all others. And when he turned toward me, there was always that same quiet acknowledgement, as though the evening itself had arranged our meeting once again without either of us needing to question it. One evening, the air turned colder than it had any right to be for that time of year. I had not thought to bring anything more than my usual coat, and I felt the chill gather at my wrists and along the edge of my collar. I said nothing of it. Still, the following night he arrived carrying a small paper packet. Without ceremony he offered it to me. Inside were roasted chestnuts, their warmth still held within their shells. I remember the way the heat rested in my palms, steady and quiet, as though it had been meant for me long before I accepted it. Another time, rain came without warning, not in heavy drops but in a fine silver drift that seemed to hover more than fall. We stood beneath the awning, close enough that I could hear the difference in sound as the rain touched wood, iron, and stone. He shifted his umbrella slightly, not drawing attention to it, just enough that the edge of it covered my sleeve. I noticed, of course, but I did not thank him. It did not feel like a kindness that required acknowledgement. It felt like something that had already been understood. We spoke sometimes, but not always. There were evenings when words seemed unnecessary, when the simple act of standing there together carried more meaning than anything we might have said. And yet, when we did speak, it was never forced. Once, in a thicker mist than usual, I told him that I had come to the station long before I had ever spoken to him. That as a child I had liked the sense that so many lives passed through one place, that it made the world feel larger than the streets I knew. He listened, as he always did, without interruption. Then he said quietly that he understood. That there had been times when stations felt less like places of departure and more like places where one might pause long enough to imagine becoming someone else. I remember looking at him then, not quickly but fully, as though I were seeing not just the man beside me, but the quiet distance he carried within him. And in that moment, something gentle and certain settled between us, something that did not ask to be spoken aloud, and yet remained, steady as the lamps that held their glow against the deepening night. As the season turned more fully toward autumn, the town seemed to draw inward upon itself, as though conserving warmth, light, and effort for the colder days to come. Evenings arrived earlier, not abruptly, but with a quiet persistence that shortened the hours of gold and lengthened the hours of shadow. By the time I reached the station now, the lamps were already lit, their glow stretching wider through the mist, softening the edges of everything they touched. I no longer came out of simple habit. That would have been too small a word for what the evenings had become. And yet, I could not have named the change without disturbing it. It was enough to walk the same road, to feel the air shift against my face, to know, without needing certainty, that he might be there. And he was, more often than not. There was a difference in him now, though I would have struggled to explain it to anyone else. He seemed less like a man in transit and more like someone who had begun quietly to arrive. The restlessness that once lingered in the way he looked down the tracks had softened. When he stood beside me, there was a stillness to him that felt newly learned, as though he were allowing himself little by little to remain where he was. One evening, when the platform lay nearly empty and the train had not yet announced itself, he spoke more than he usually did. His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it that held a different weight, something not heavy but deliberate. He told me that years ago, he had stood at a station not unlike this one and boarded a train he had not been certain he should take. Not because the journey itself was wrong, but because it carried him away from something he had not yet understood how to keep. After that, he said, it became easier to continue moving than to pause long enough to question whether he should remain. One place led to another. One departure gave reason for the next. He did not speak of regret, only of motion. I listened, aware of the quiet around us, of the lamps holding their steady glow, of the way the mist seemed to gather more closely as though it too were listening. When he finished, there was no urgency in me to respond. The silence that followed felt complete in itself. And yet, after a moment, I said softly that staying could require its own kind of courage. He did not answer immediately. But I felt, rather than saw, the way something in him shifted, not suddenly, but with the slow certainty of something long considered and finally allowed. After that, we spoke less on some evenings, not because there was less to say, but because there was less need to say it. The time we shared seemed to stretch more gently now. Minutes lost their edges. The expected hour of the train felt less important than the quiet space before it. And still, there were small peculiarities, though I had come to accept them as part of the place itself. Once, the station clock appeared to pause entirely, its hands resting between moments as though uncertain whether to continue. Another time, what felt like only a short conversation left me returning home far later than I had intended, the house already dim and settled for the night. None of it frightened me. If anything, it felt as though the platform in that last hour of evening had begun to keep time in its own way, one that did not measure itself by departure or arrival but by presence. And within that presence we remained. There came an evening late in the season, when the air held that deep, quiet stillness that arrives just before winter begins to make itself known. The mist lay low across the tracks, not drifting as it usually did, but resting as though it had chosen to remain. The lamps burned wider halos than before, their light diffused into something softer, something that seemed to reach farther without growing brighter. I remember that the platform was nearly empty. Mr. Fenwick had checked his watch more than once, then, with a small shake of his head, stepped into his office, as though time had become something he could no longer entirely persuade. Jonah had already wheeled the last of the luggage away, his footsteps fading into the quiet beyond the wall. The station, for once, seemed to release its usual sense of purpose and settle into a kind of waiting that had no clear object. He stood beside me as he had on so many evenings before. We did not speak at first. There was no need to. The rails stretched into the dim distance, unbroken by light or sound. The expected moment for the train passed, then moved gently beyond itself, unnoticed except for the absence it left behind. No whistle came. No distant glow announced its approach. No vibration stirred through the iron beneath our feet. It was not alarming. It did not feel like something missing. It felt, instead, like something pausing, like the world itself had chosen just for a little while not to continue. I turned slightly toward him, though I had already felt the change before I saw it. "I am not leaving tomorrow," he said. His voice was steady, without emphasis, without any trace of uncertainty. It did not sound like a decision made in haste, nor like something offered for approval. It sounded like something that had been true for some time and had only now found its way into words. I looked at him then, fully, without hesitation. I cannot say that I was surprised. What I felt was closer to recognition, as though some quiet part of me had been waiting, not anxiously, not expectantly, but patiently, for this moment to arrive in its own time. The mist remained. The lamps held their gentle light. Somewhere far beyond the station, the sea continued its slow and endless rhythm against the shore. Nothing dramatic followed. No grand declaration. No sudden movement. We simply stood there, side by side, in the space where the train should have been, and allowed the moment to be enough. A place made for departures had, without announcement, become a place where someone stayed. And for the first time, the passing of time did not feel like something we were waiting on. After that evening, the town did not change in any way that could be easily named. Morning still arrived with its pale light along the rooftops, and the shop still opened as it always had. I folded fabric, measured ribbon, and wrapped parcels with the same careful attention, my hands moving through familiar tasks without hesitation. My aunt kept her accounts. The bell above the door rang and settled, as though nothing beyond its small circle had shifted at all. And yet, something had. The evenings remained, but they were no longer shaped by uncertainty. I still walked to the station, still felt the cool air rest against my skin, still watched the lamps gather their quiet glow through the mist. But now, when I stepped onto the platform, I did not wonder whether he would be there. He was. Not as a traveler pausing between departures, but as someone who had allowed himself to remain. There was a steadiness in that, a calm that did not need to announce itself. We spoke as we always had, sometimes lightly, sometimes not at all. The silence between us had become something full and easy, like a place already understood. The trains continued to come and go. Their schedules resumed their quiet authority. Mr. Fenwick returned to his watch, Jonah to his work. The small order of the station settled once more into its familiar shape. But the platform kept something of that paused evening within it. And so did I. I no longer came to watch the passing of things. I came because something at last had chosen to stay. Thank you for staying with me as we lingered on the quiet railway platform, where time softened and love found its gentle place between arrivals and departures. If this story brought you comfort, you're welcome to like and subscribe for more calming journeys to accompany your nights. Sleep deeply, hold on to that quiet warmth, and let the distant rhythm of the rails carry you softly into peaceful dreams.